I'm Sjoerd. I'm a software architect at Picnic. Picnic is an online supermarket. And let me just put that in perspective straight away. I'm a software architect, but since we're a startup, I'm a software developer, and I tend to also have opinions on the bigger picture as well. As you can see, there was very little space in the title slide. And if you look in the program booklet, we have a pretty long title. So I figured I should just make a separate slide for this. And there's a bit of story to the title as well. Wasn't actually coined by me. A couple of months ago, our CTO, Daniel, he came to me and said, I saw the announcement for Codemotion, and I think we should have a talk there. And me, I'm a pretty quiet person, so I will have said something like, sure. All right, but will you give a talk there? Sure. Can it be about microservices? Yeah? We are doing microservices, right? Well, yeah, all right, but the conference is only in a couple of months' time, so, by that time we'll be doing microservices, right? I said, well, no. Thing is, we're not doing microservices. So I had a bit of a talk with him, and about a week later he came to my office and said, perfect, I've arranged a talk for us, and the title is Architecture for Optimal Trade-off Between Engineering and Operations Efficiency, and that's how I got stuck trying to fit that on a title slide. Now, it's a long title, but it really depicts one of the big trade-offs in any startup, I think, and especially for Picnic. Engineering and operations are two things that really conflict at times. What we see is that engineering excellence is all about getting it right, getting it perfect. Operations excellence is about getting it good enough now, because otherwise it doesn't matter anymore. And trying to sort out where the balance should lie is actually a really big challenge for us. Now, what I want to do in this talk is not give you a silver bullet. I'm not really giving you the answer to all your problems. But what I want to avoid is basically what's depicted in this XKCD comic from a couple of weeks ago, I think. Thought it was funny. It's actually, it's pretty relevant to the field of microservices. You get a lot of people coming to you with stories like, we did it, we went to microservices, we did it this way, and we are loving it. But that doesn't mean that they didn't make a serious investments, and there could have been other routes. And yeah, you should always be aware that any solution presented to you is a solution for whoever was presenting it, and it doesn't have to be a solution for you. So that's what I want to warn you about. Given my talk, please take it with a grain of salt. We are really experimenting around with a lot of different things, and we might have actually come to a completely different solution the second time round. So, microservices. Apparently it's a talk about microservices. What do we hear now from the microservices community? Well, if you look in the program booklet, I think there's 3 talks on microservices, and pretty much all of them have the same story. At some point, you move to microservices, and you're happy with that, and before that, you had a monolith, and a lot of people actually claim that you should always start with a monolith. I have no argument there. I think this is the sane approach. If you start with microservices, then you're probably doing something wrong in terms of how you approach your startup, because that means a serious investment right at the start. But what's often not really discussed is the whole trajectory in between, because if you're making a move from monolith to microservices, then that means that you must have been at some point in the middle of the way. You must have been halfway somewhere. Now, microservices themselves, there's no definition actually what a microservice is. And a monolith, well, I can think of a lot of different ways in which you could implement a monolith application. So there's no real definition of what that is either. So it's a bit of a bold claim to say that we are somewhere in the middle. But we are. And what we're trying to do at Picnic now is to turn that frown upside down. We want to make sure that when we are going from monolith to microservices, that we're not actually doing this because we have to. We're not doing this to overcome some big problem, and we don't want to be stuck in the middle thinking it's going to be better later on. No, we want to just be in that sweet spot all along. We want to make sure that the transition in itself is going to be as comfortable as possible. So, before I continue, I want to give you a bit of a background on what Picnic is and what we do. So in a nutshell, this is Picnic. What we would like to do for you is to just eliminate the whole concept of a supermarket. What we would like you to do is to just be able to think of your groceries and they just appear right in front of you. Now, we had a call with Elon Musk, and it turns out that the human brain interfacing is not quite up to scratch yet. As far as I heard, he's actually not started on teleportation either. So for now, we chose a slightly less high-tech solution. We went for, well, a solution where you bring the supermarket to your pocket by means of your phone. And when you have ordered your stuff on your phone, it gets delivered to your doorstep, and we even have people who will actually put stuff in your fridge if you want them to. So that's as easy as we can make it for you. So let me just compare that first with what a normal supermarket does, because I want to show you what's so exciting about Picnic. And for that, we just have to look at where does stuff come from and where does it go. So on the left-hand side, we have suppliers, and the suppliers, they just produce stuff and then ship it to our warehouse. In the warehouse, we just store stuff for a while, but we try to do this as little as possible because that's just a waste of money. But from the warehouse, usually you would then start distributing this over multiple brick stores that are spread around the country. You would then have people displaying them nicely for people to look at. And then all these people will take their individual cars, drive all the way to the supermarket, go for a 2-hour shopping trip, getting the shopping trolleys pushed in their ankles, and then after 2 hours of greatness, you return home with your groceries. There's a lot of people who don't think this is a fun activity. Now that's where we think the business lies, so what we try to do is just completely change that model. Now, the most interesting thing about this picture is that everything from the warehouse to the homes is all operations by Picnic. So we are doing everything ourselves there. So the distribution is as much part of Picnic as the actual buying and selling of goods. And it's in fact one of the more influential topics within Picnic. So what do we have? Well, on the right-hand side, we have the apps. We have an iOS app and an Android app, and they communicate to a backend server. And that's where I want to go into a bit more detail now. So for the microservices topic, I thought, let's go into which kinds of services do we have here. Well, first of all, there's a gateway server. That's just a server that exposes all the functionality to the apps. Should be quite simple. If you look at the piece of code that is written for this, it gets chunkier by the minute. So it's actually more complicated than we thought it would be. I'll come back to that later. Then there's vehicle routing. We do our own vehicle routing as well. So if there's orders been placed, then we just figure out what the most the most efficient route is for the delivery vehicles, and we make sure that we plan around through an area and try to minimize our drop times. Then there's distribution planning, which says not so much of something about how the product gets to the client, it says something about how the product gets from the warehouse to the delivery vehicles themselves, because of course there's still the step from supplier to delivery vehicles to bridge. Then from the other side, there's purchasing management, so we need to buy stuff from our suppliers. We need to know how much we need to buy. We need to know when to buy it. We need to know when it's going to be delivered. There's warehouse management. So within the warehouse, we have all kinds of processes that are pretty specific to Picnic by now, because our delivery vehicles, for instance, they have these frames in them with crates, and the crates have to be in the right positions. And in order to all do this efficiently, you already need to know in the warehouse how it's going to be delivered and what your route is going to be. And it turns out that it's actually pretty difficult to get such a whole pipeline to work with just off-the-shelf products. So we're actually pulling a lot of this functionality in-house as we go along. And then in between, we have a whole bunch of core services like just user management, management of communication with users, so emails, SMS, whatever you can think of. Order management is, as you would expect it, just a bunch of orders and some querying around it. Stock management, which is actually an interesting bit because we try to minimize the stock that we keep in the warehouse. And that means that we try to order as late as possible. So the moment that we know that, for instance, our bread is ordered every day exactly enough for the day after to be able to supply the users who actually ordered the bread. We don't keep it in stock. Yeah, so for this we have a separate service. There's the catalog service, which just gives you all the products that we sell. There's finance, which does a little bit of accounting that's then pushed to the external accounting system. And then on top of that, there's a whole bunch of more cross-cutting concerns. So Slack integration, we have a lot of systems that are talking to Slack so everyone can be informed real time that something is going wrong or that something is going right. We have workforce planning, there's real-time analytics, which is a great topic as well, but a whole different topic. So our data engineering team is also pretty happy. Admin pages for all the services, product search, which is Elasticsearch based. So there's lots of stuff that's also used in a couple of different services as well. So if you look at that picture, you'd say that's actually an ideal world to be going to this microservices model, because there's a lot of different problem domains that are fairly separate. You can envisage that there might be quite clean APIs between them. So, you know, microservices, everyone knows what it is, and if you don't, then no matter, because there's no definition anyway. You get for free isolation, so if something goes wrong, it only goes wrong there, and it doesn't spread to the rest of your system. You get scalability, which is something that any growing company would like to have. You want to start doing continuous integration and continuous deployment. Well, continuous integration is, you know, we're starting to do this, but continuous deployment is actually not that common yet, and pretty interesting topic. You get to adopt new technologies. In every single microservice, you could be running a completely different tech stack. So if you have a service that really lends itself very well to functional programming, choose a functional language. If you have somewhere that just needs some kind of completely different database technology, just use it in that microservice. Great. It just makes you able to move really fast at a large scale. So, you know, I hope that was a fair summary of most of the microservice talks that you might have heard before. So, as Picnic, we also need to do a sanity check there, because when you hear about microservices, one of the big examples that's going to be mentioned is Netflix. Immensely successful, also immensely successful at deploying microservices, lots of great technology coming from there. But in 2009, when they started to make the move towards microservices, they had a pretty big team. They had an annual revenue of about $1.6 billion. That's quite, you know, you already have a pretty good thing going then. We're in a bit of a different situation. We started 2.5 years ago. We're trying to scale up as fast as we can, but you know, we need all our power to actually get stuff done, and we can't spend hours and hours just looking at how to deploy stuff. We just want to get stuff to the customers, because that's what counts for us right now. So here I get back to this picture, and I warn you, it's going to be, I think, 2 more slides that are exactly the same, so it's a pretty cheap presentation to make. Yeah, so microservices, it sounds super nice, but do we actually want to be there, or are we actually happy not being there? Now, what we don't want is one large monolith that in 3 years' time we are going to completely have to refactor and just tear it all up and then go make one big move to microservices. You really want to prevent that. So what we hope that we can do, and that's, I'm going to give you a bit of an idea of how we're trying to do this, is that we can stay in the middle and that we can, in a controlled fashion, move forward. And that, well, basically that we just plan for this move. We're not going to actually make the move yet. In some cases, even if we could potentially do it by just investing a lot of time in it, we're just going to sit back and relax until the moment comes that it actually pays off for us to do this. Okay, that is emptier than I thought it would be. So, some conflicts that we saw with microservices. So, first of all, separation of concerns, which is basically what microservices is, but then on a different level than you're used to, comes with overhead. It comes with a lot of overhead, actually. What you need to do is you need to separate your domains. You have APIs in between. The APIs need to be fairly stable. You need to think about serialization all of a sudden where normally you wouldn't have. There's just lots of extra boilerplate that you're going to write just to be able to do microservices in the first place. Continuous integration, continuous deployment, I already mentioned it. It's a big investment. You really need to know that you're going to get it right. If you go online, you just get a couple of presentations up from people who do this, they all warn you that you should set up a number of other things first before you can even start thinking about this. And the number of things that you have to set up, it's a pretty long list. You have to do quite a lot. Because you don't want to deploy without knowing when something actually broke your production system. So you need to have your logging, your alerting, you have to have it perfectly tuned before you can start doing this, or you'll completely lose control. And then one phrase that you hear a lot from microservices is do one thing, but do it really well. Well, for microservices, for all our microservices, we can ask the question, so what thing should that be then? And the truth is, we don't know. I mean, hands up, all of you who started building a supermarket in their spare time. Where do you start? I mean, we didn't know. I mean, we're just a bunch of developers. We're a pretty small team. We know what a supermarket is, obviously. We know what it is to move things from A to B as well. That doesn't make you an expert in any of the domains that are involved in running an online supermarket. And we're actually doing things completely different by having this entire trajectory under control. So even if you would listen to all the domain experts, you'd probably fall into all kinds of traps that you would have much rather avoided. So yeah, let's face it, we didn't know what we were building, and that makes it very hard to compartmentalize and to say, okay, this service is going to be doing exactly this thing and is going to be doing it really well, because the next week you might think that this service should be doing something else, or that it should be doing more or less, or that you should move some functionality to another service. Yeah, that's a kind of movement that just makes it really, really difficult to go for this microservices approach straight away. And then, as I said, we have a small team. And if you hear talks about microservices, they will tell you that your company structure needs to reflect your architecture. And I totally agree with this. There is no sense in making a microservice and then saying, okay, we're just going to do this in code, but in the end, everyone's just going to maintain all the microservices here, because then you get feature creep everywhere. You are going to see that your scope is going to be well defined at first, and then slowly things are going to merge with other services, and you've basically built yourself this horrendous network, which is actually a monolith but distributed, which makes it just even harder to work with. And then the variation in technology, what I said about if you want to program in a functional language, then you should be able to, is really nice, but you can only do this the moment that you have enough people working for you and that you know that you can get replacement when you need to. And right now we're working with 25 people on getting an entire supermarket running. If every one of them starts adopting a different technology stack, that means that nobody will be able to repair each other's code. So if one of them gets under a bus, we're damned. So that's picnic now. We have a small team. The most important thing, I think, for us right now is time to market. We really can't afford to lose pace. The most important thing is that we just show that we're here, that we are doing cool stuff, and that we can actually make your life easier. And you can only do this by just having something to show. So we really just need to keep pushing out new things. There's lots of different disciplines, as I said, so the distribution side and the warehousing side, that with the shop backend, the shop frontend, they're all completely different domains. And on top of that, so these are all things that are going to hinder you a little bit in microservices, but on top of that, we still have that while we're growing, we're actually also building a growing business that is actually something that needs to keep running as well. We can't just say to our customers, okay guys, no groceries for 2 weeks because we're delivering this fantastic new feature, you're really going to love it. But yeah, 2 weeks, no groceries, sorry. You can't do this. So we need to also keep operations as efficient as possible because we are growing and we are getting more customers every week. And the moment that starts falling, our investors will also think that this is not such a good idea anymore. So yeah, the focus is completely different if you compare this to, for instance, Netflix. So this was Picnic now, then how do we see Picnic later? Well, the focus should be, by then, much more on innovation to do stuff that we've never dreamed of doing. Right now, we are doing innovation because we know that we need to get there, and we are just innovative enough to make sure that we can actually get there. Hopefully, in a couple of years' time, we have an established market position, we can relax a bit and start thinking of really cool new stuff to do with this. And we can focus solely on innovation because it's innovation, because we want to do cool stuff. Hopefully we'll have so many employees that we can really have a lot of different small teams, which then can also have their own individual microservices that they are maintaining. Hopefully we'll also gain even more disciplines because it's a lot of fun having a lot of different disciplines in-house. It means that you get to see the most bizarre problems from different fields. So for our engineers, it actually makes it really nice to be able to skip to different microservices as well and just learn a lot about the world, because you really see everything from customer complaints to just mathematical problems in distribution, for instance. And last but not least, hopefully in a couple of years' time, we actually know what we're doing. So by that time, we hope that we can actually say this service is an actual service. It's not a figment of our imagination. This is actually something that's doing something instrumental to what Picnic does as a whole. So by that time, we will start looking a bit more like Netflix. So that's when we think maybe then we want to be in a position that we can say we are doing microservices, and maybe then I'll be holding one of those talks saying, oh, we went through microservices, and it's great. It's great over there. Just to give you a little bit of a hint on what the future is going to hold for Picnic, I pinched these slides from Daniel just a couple of minutes ago. I had never seen them myself. But yeah, so right now, well, maybe not right now, we're actually in the next slide already, but we'll get to that. When we started, we have a real layered approach where we had just the systems of record, so basically databases, then a whole bunch of middleware, here systems of interaction, which just does a bunch of stuff on the data that we have, and then that is communicated to the apps, so the apps can give you a nice interface to work with it. Obviously, there's also some administration interfaces for ourselves, so we can do some stuff. So yeah, a really layered model, very classic. Now we're currently in the phase that we're moving to a slightly more coupled model, where actually this logic and the data they are starting to merge, because we see you can't see them as separate things anymore, especially if you want to give feedback in real time. You have to think about data in your logic, and you have to think about the logic in your data. So we're bringing that together, and we see that the data team and the engineering team are actually working closer and closer together here. And then the next step, and that's where we want to head now, and that's where microservices in the lower layer here would be super nice to have, is to introduce a layer of true intelligence above that, where we actually start thinking AI first, and start thinking about what can we do by just looking at our systems, which decisions, which more high-level business decisions can we make in an automated way. Right now, there's still a lot of operations are still done by human beings, just looking at charts and going, oh, maybe we should just tweak these parameters a bit. In the end, you want to start automating all of that so you can run really large scale. Now, that's all super exciting. We're not there yet, but this gives you a bit of an idea of why we want to make our architecture as scalable as possible. So, this slide again, just to keep me back on track, because I tend to go on a bit. Yeah, so I've covered now why we want to go to microservices, and why I think we should start with a monolith, and why we are now more at the monolith side than microservices. I want to give you a bit of an impression of what journey we've already made and what it currently looks like. So this is the timeline for Picnic. July 2014, this date I got by just looking at what was the first commit in our code base. I'm not sure when the actual ideas for Picnic started. It was long before that. I only joined at the beginning of 2016. But yes, July 2014, a bunch of guys started hacking away at it, and they started with a stack based on Amazon Web Services. Why Amazon? Because we knew it. There were people there with experience. We didn't want to go for something super new and exciting. We wanted something to work. So Amazon Web Services built on Elastic Beanstalk, actually, using Spring applications, using MongoDB for storage. That was hip and trendy. We are actually, in some cases, quite happy that we did it, and in some cases it turns out that this is not such a good idea. So yeah, that was one of the riskier decisions we made, and we see that there are pros and cons. RabbitMQ for messaging. Well, when we started, we had Bitbucket and Bamboo, and with that came Jira and Confluence, which we still use. And they started building. And when they started building, they built this layered application that I just showed you. And then in 2015, slowly, we started moving to GitHub, started using Travis for continuous integration. So actually right now, if you commit to, well, we just have a sort of Git flow where you just you create your features in a feature branch, it gets merged back to develop is deployed automatically to a test environment where you can see your changes live. So that's quite nice, but we're not quite there to say that we do the full continuous integration yet. 2016 was an exciting year because that's when we started pulling in a bit of the warehousing functionality. So we started on pulling in some of the warehouse management software, which was previously external third-party system. That was out of the box, but we started having some trouble configuring it exactly to do what we needed from it from a Picnic point of view. And there we see that slowly we start actually introducing more and more technology, but always with a very valid reason. So here we see Postgres entering the picture, and the reason for this is that we had MongoDB first, and normally we would have said, okay, the next service, we'll just build it with the same stack because we should still be able to hire the same people as we always were doing. We have a small team. Everyone should be able to edit each other's code. And here we said, okay, we really need to make a change. Why? Transactionality. It's really very difficult to build a warehousing system if you don't have transactions. So we decided to make it easy for ourselves. And if you look at the warehouse management system, that's a pretty classical database application. So one of our microservices is actually a monolith. Slowly, we are also adopting RxJava. We're now looking into other ways of deploying our application as well. So who knows, maybe we'll go for Kubernetes or something similar. And that's planned for later this year. So we're slowly making this move already, but you still can't really say that we're doing microservices at all. Just to give you a bit of insight into what it was like in the beginning, this is actually an image that was, I found this on Confluence. It's the first architectural image ever made from Picnic, where we describe which services we thought we were going to have. It's wildly inaccurate, but it gives you a good impression. So these three layers that are not blurred out, those are the backend. And the original idea is we have one fulfillment layer, which is just going to support the fulfillment processes, which is everything from warehouse management to distribution. We're going to have one support layer, which contains all the systems that have data in them. And then we have the public interface to all backend systems, and that was the other layer. Actually, when I joined, this was pretty close to what was still there. So we had 3 deployments, so 3 Elastic Beanstalk deployments, and that's it. And it really works. I mean, we had a supermarket already at that point. Current architecture, you see that all the blue blocks are deployments. So you see that we get a lot more deployments over time. And actually some of these are duplicated. So this guy over here actually is not one deployment, there's one for every FC that we open. So the moment they open a new FC, we get a new deployment there as well. So we're already splitting things up a little bit, but we are still having a lot of different services per deployment. So this is where the name came from. Meso just means halfway or middle in Latin. So thank you, Daniel, for coining this term. It's our interpretation of where we want to be in the spectrum of monolith to microservices. So in what we do, which things that we take away from microservices that we actually adhere to? Well, separation of concerns. We really try to make sure that when we start something new, we try to figure out, does it belong in any of the services that we already have or not? Do we need to think about making this a new service? We don't start hacking it into something without first thinking, might this become a different deployment at some point in time? In fact, when they started building, they already made some services communicate over REST, even though they were deployed on the same node, just to make sure that there was a boundary there. We are trying to program API first. We try to think first, what do we want of this service? We don't first think, let's build the implementation, then expose that over the API. No, we first start thinking, what does the other service want from this one? Design the API, and then think about how you're going to implement that. We use messaging and we use HTTP REST calls between the different services. So that's already in the spirit of microservices. And well, we're trying to stick to the approach that anything that is truly an event, in the sense that it can be interpreted just by looking at the thing itself, and it can be understood by anyone, then it's an event. If it's a command, then we try to do it over HTTP. So if you're doing RPC, we're trying to do this over REST calls. Maybe in the future we'll start looking into, say, gRPC or something, but right now it's super convenient to have all these REST calls, because it also means that via Swagger, for instance, we now have a user interface that we can use to do some simple checks on our own systems, or even do some repairs in some cases. We stick to a collection per service, so we already have pretty local data access. So yeah, we're getting there, but there's also a couple of things that we really threw out the window. We don't want all these services to be deployed separately. We don't have continuous deployment. We have a weekly release process, because right now it saves us more by just not having to deal with the fallout, but just having a fairly stable release and knowing what's in the release every time. We limited our tech stack really, really thoroughly, so we have a Java stack everywhere, so Spring Boot basically, with a number of standard technologies on there. We don't have all kinds of different programming languages. And there's still a couple of things that we're still trying to figure out as well, of course. So data ownership is a big one. Which service owns which piece of data? This is actually a really fundamental question, and it's very difficult to answer in some cases. But it really defines what your API is going to look like. It defines very much on how well different services are going to be able to work together. And sometimes you might have to decide based on this that two services should be merged, because otherwise it becomes way too difficult to get any form of consistency in your data. So that brings me to the second one, transactions. What to do with transactions? Eventual consistency is a nice thing, but yeah, I've done a PhD in concurrency theory, and my main takeaway from 5 years of doing that is, if you can avoid concurrency, then do so, because it's super difficult to get right. Then client libraries. There's all kinds of people with opinions on whether you should use client libraries or not when you're doing microservices. We just don't know. In some cases, it's really comfortable to just be able to import the library and use that service, but it goes against the idea that any different service in a different language should be able to use that service. So a lot of people advocate that every service should themselves define their proxy to your microservice. If you want to move fast and you have a technology stack like ours that is pretty much the same over all your services, libraries are pretty nice. So, what we're doing, dividing while conquering. So, you do split up, you do go to microservices, but you only start splitting off services when the domain is clear, so when you know what you're doing. When you actually have a team available to start taking care of this microservice, it shouldn't be this orphan that then sometimes gets looked after or maybe gets pulled into another team's responsibilities. And you only do it when you actually needed to change something there anyway. You're not going to just make a project out of going microservice because you just get the fallout, you don't get the benefits. And that's what I wanted to close with. So I hope that everyone here also will start publishing ideas on the internet as well about how to make this transition comfortable, because I think that's the only thing that I'm missing right now as an architect. If you are looking on the internet, they'll tell you, you go from monolith to microservices, but they don't tell you how, and they don't tell you how to make it comfortable. We'll try to publish our ideas. If you do the same, I'd be much obliged. Thank you.
Yeah, one question you briefly mentioned it around data ownership, because I'm not sure if I got it right. You sound more like you're trying to avoid the duplication of data, or is it also something because for us, when we've seen sometimes easier just to have a copy by listening on it? What are your thoughts on that, and how do you roll that out in the real world?
That's exactly why it was on that list, of course. It's one of the big pickles. Are you going to duplicate your data and then risk that it gets out of sync? We tend to go for now, because we have a setup that is really, it's deployed in the same cloud, it's really close. We don't have much data that actually needs to be accessed in real time. So the data that needs to be accessed in real time, we duplicate in a sense, but only by having ad hoc caches everywhere, which is actually pretty nice, because it means if you restart your system, it just gets in sync again. So if you ever get into consistency problems, you just restart the whole bunch. It repairs itself. We are seeing some situations now where maybe this is not feasible anymore. So yeah, we need to go to a model where you will have to duplicate your data. I think it's the only way forward for really scaling up your microservices ideas. But it comes with such a big overhead also in thinking about what happens to your data that we currently still try to minimize it, because yeah, as I said, we need to focus right now on delivering functionality, and scaling up it's the next thing on the roadmap, but functionality comes first now, and stability of our systems.
Thanks.
No more questions? Then thank you again.
Thank you.